The early years, seeds of activism. Howard Zinn's story began not in the halls of academia or the protests of the 1960s, but in the gritty streets of Brooklyn. Born in 1922, Zinn came from humble beginnings, his childhood shaped by the harsh realities of working-class life. His parents, poor Jewish immigrants, struggled to make ends meet, teaching him the value of hard work, but also exposing him to the stark divisions that define society. From an early age, Zinn witnessed injustice in its many forms. His family's economic hardship was a daily reminder of the chasm between the rich and poor, a reality that would fuel Zinn's passion for fairness throughout his life. But it wasn't just poverty that shaped his view of the world. Growing up in Brooklyn, Zinn was exposed to the struggles of racial and ethnic minorities. His neighborhood was a melting pot of different cultures, but also a place where prejudice and inequality simmered beneath the surface. His life was forever changed during World War II. At 18, Zinn enlisted in the Army Air Corps, eager to serve his country. As a bombardier in a B-17 bomber, he saw the horrors of war up close. But it wasn't the enemy he encountered that shook him. It was the impact of his own actions. Zinn was forced to participate in bombing raids over Europe, often targeting civilian areas. The devastation was indiscriminate, and Zinn was left haunted by the destruction he helped cause. This brutal reality challenged his understanding of heroism, patriotism, and justice. After the war, Zinn returned to the United States, disillusioned and searching for answers. He enrolled at Columbia University, determined to make sense of the world he had witnessed. It was here that Zinn's journey into activism truly began. He saw firsthand the racial segregation and injustice that plagued the country, particularly in the South. In 1956, Zinn took a teaching position at Spelman College in Atlanta, where he encountered the fierce racial divide that still defined much of the nation. His students, African-American women, had a unique perspective on the world, one of resilience in the face of oppression. These stories of survival and strength struck Zinn deeply, and he found himself increasingly drawn to the causes of civil rights and social justice. His early years, shaped by his family's struggles, the horrors of war, and the personal stories of his students, began to crystallize into a guiding philosophy. History was not just a record of the powerful, but of the oppressed. Zinn's purpose was clear. He would challenge the dominant narrative, the one that silenced the voices of those who fought for justice, equality, and freedom. As Zinn's activism grew, so did his conviction that the stories of the oppressed must be told. The seeds of rebellion had been sown in his early years, and the path forward was set. The young man who had once dropped bombs from a plane now sought to dismantle the systems that allowed such destruction. The conflict was no longer external, but internal, a war against the very structures that perpetuated inequality. The fight for a better world was just beginning, shaping the voice of resistance. In the early 1960s, Howard Zinn's intellectual journey took a decisive turn. Having witnessed the brutality of war and the grinding poverty of his youth, he found himself increasingly at odds with the sanitized versions of history that dominated American textbooks. Now, as a professor at Spelman College in Atlanta, Zinn had a unique vantage point. He was not only teaching history but living its contradictions. The South was a battleground of racial tensions, where the fight for civil rights was igniting a storm of resistance. Zinn's students, African-American women determined to earn their education despite the segregated South, became his most powerful teachers. They spoke of their daily struggles with grace and dignity, their experiences of systemic racism, and their unyielding desire for equality. These voices, silenced by mainstream history, echoed in Zinn's mind as he stood before them. He realized that the stories of the oppressed, those who were never represented in traditional history, were the true history, the one that mattered. With a newfound sense of urgency, Zinn began to question the very structure of history itself. History, he argued, was not a neutral record of events. It was a carefully constructed narrative, written by those in power to serve their interests. The powerful, landowners, politicians, and businessmen, were the ones whose stories dominated the pages of textbooks. But what of the stories of slaves, indigenous peoples, laborers, and women? They were absent, or worse, misrepresented. In 1963, Zinn published an article that would later serve as a foundation for his larger work, The Southern Negro and the Struggle for Equal Rights. His approach was revolutionary. He took the voices of ordinary people, people whose lives had been ignored, and gave them center stage. His writing was unflinching, and he sought to expose the brutal realities of segregation, not through the lens of politics or economics, but through the lived experiences of those fighting against it. But this wasn't enough for Zinn. He wasn't content to simply tell the stories. He wanted to change the world. His teaching evolved into something more radical. He didn't just teach facts. He inspired his students to take action. Spelman became a hotbed of activism, with Zinn students not only challenging the institution, but also taking part in sit-ins and protests against segregation. Zinn's classroom was no longer a passive space for learning. It became a crucible for activism, where history was both taught and made. Zinn's frustrations with the limitations of conventional history culminated in a bold decision. He would write a book that told history from the perspective of the oppressed. A people's history of the United States would be a history like no other. A history that questioned the status quo, that rejected the narratives of victors, and instead told the story of the common people. It would be a weapon for change, a guide for those who believed in justice and equality. The seeds of this radical project were now fully planted. As Zinn prepared to write, he knew he was embarking on a journey that would transform both his life and the way the world understood its past. The struggle for a fairer, more inclusive history was just beginning, and Howard Zinn was determined to lead the charge. Controversy and legacy. The publication of A People's History of the United States in 1980 was nothing short of a literary earthquake. Howard Zinn had shattered the established norms of historical scholarship, rejecting the glorified narratives of conquest and progress that dominated American history textbooks. His book was not just a work of scholarship. It was a challenge to the very foundation of how history was told. It ignited a firestorm of debate. Zinn's approach was simple yet profound. He told the story of the United States through the eyes of those who had been silenced: the indigenous peoples, the slaves, the workers, the women, and the poor. In stark contrast to the mainstream history that celebrated the deeds of presidents and generals, Zinn's history was raw, unflinching, and unapologetically radical. He focused on the struggles of the oppressed, their battles for justice, and their resilience in the face of brutal systems of power. But the reception was anything but welcoming. The establishment, both academic and political, was deeply uncomfortable with Zinn's portrayal of America. Critics accused him of being biased, of oversimplifying complex historical events, and of presenting a one-sided narrative. Scholars from prestigious universities dismissed his work as ideological, a distortion of history designed to push a political agenda. They argued that history should be impartial, that it should highlight both the successes and the failures of a nation, and that Zinn's work was dangerously divisive. Despite the criticism, A People's History resonated with a broad audience. It found a place in classrooms, in the hands of students, and in the hearts of activists. The book became a beacon for those disillusioned by the status quo, offering a narrative that aligned more closely with their own experiences. Zinn's work struck a chord with a generation of people seeking truth in a world full of half-truths and omissions. Yet, the controversy didn't stop with academic critiques. Zinn himself became a target of political attacks. Conservatives, particularly those in power, saw his work as subversive, a threat to the national identity they sought to protect. Politicians decried his book as un-American, accusing him of undermining the country's values and sowing distrust in its institutions. Zinn was portrayed as a dangerous radical, a historian whose work could erode patriotism and unity. But Zinn stood firm. He did not shy away from the attacks. In fact, he welcomed them, for they proved his point. The very people who were attacking him were the ones who had historically written the dominant narratives. They were the same voices that had silenced the oppressed for centuries. Zinn's response to his critics was simple. History was never neutral. It was a tool wielded by those in power, and only by exposing the hidden stories of resistance could true change occur. Despite the controversy, Zinn's legacy endured. A People's History became a cornerstone of progressive education, a book that challenged generations of readers to reconsider the history they had been taught. His work sparked new ways of thinking about history, activism, and social justice. Zinn's voice, though often drowned out by the noise of his critics, continued to echo in the movements for racial justice, labor rights, and anti-imperialism. The conflict was far from over. Zinn knew that history was a battleground, one where the winners did not always write the truth. And so, he fought on, one page, one lecture, one